So this podcast is going to be called Take Back History, and the premise is just I want to make a history series that is really about history as a practice a little bit more than a lot of popular history stuff. And they tell stories.
Yep.
Really. And that's part of it. That's always going to be part of it. But I'm really interested in
the how it's done.
The how it's done, what kind of things you actually have to think about looking into these things.
Yep.
Today I'm going to be joined to talk about maybe a fascist movement that you haven't heard about as much and what we need to be looking at now when we look back at these histories to understand our current situation. I'm joined by historian of fascism, Roland Clark. Thank you so much for joining me, Roland.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. There's a lot I want to ask you about this. We're going to get into Romanian fascism very soon, but I kind of want to open with my least favorite question, but one that I feel like has to happen. I'm sure I don't need to tell you, scholars of fascism, they spend so much time really splitting hairs about what exactly is a fascism. Is it only Nazism if it's from the Nazi region of Germany, which was all of it? Is it just sparkling fascism otherwise? Do you think these conversations are useful to the extent that they continue to happen? And where do you fall on that? Do you have a framework for how you say this is fascism as opposed to just conservatism or something else?
Yeah, sure. So in the interwar period, everyone knew what fascism was, and so no one bothered defining it.
Right.
The fascism in the interwar period basically meant if I identify with Mussolini or with Hitler, and I think those guys are great guys, then I'm probably a fascist. But at the same time, someone like de Rivera in Spain, he wanted to have his own movement and say this is a Spanish movement grounded in Spanish things, and so he didn't want people to think that it was stolen from Germany or Italy. And so he refused to call himself a fascist, even though everything he did was really clearly part of fascism. And he even goes to international conferences. He meets with other fascists abroad. So my basic working definition is if people identified with and promoted and were friends with fascists, they were probably fascists. That's not a really widespread definition in the field. Actually, the quest, we call it the quest for a fascist minimum.
Right.
So what's the minimum definition that you have to satisfy in order to be considered a fascist? And that starts in 1965. So 20 years after fascism's defeated, someone comes along and says, well, actually, we should ask, what is fascism? And it's not as simple as it sounds, because you want to start with something like anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism was huge in Germany and in most of Eastern Europe, but it was completely irrelevant in Italy. And so that if you put anti-Semitism into the definition of fascism, you've excluded Mussolini, who's the guy that invented fascism. And you say, okay, so it's about a small group of people that want to use violence to create revolutionary change in my country. That includes the Bolsheviks in Russia. So that definition's no good. Mm-hmm. And we've gone back and forth. And during the 90s, there was a long, like a trend to say, well, let's have 10 bullet points, and if your movement ticks more than about 8 of them, you're probably a fascist. Until around 1995, Roger Griffin from Oxford Brookes University comes up with this definition where he says fascism is an ideology of national palingenesis or national rebirth. And that really sweeps the field because it's something that fascists everywhere were talking about. I want to take my country, I consider my country to be backward or degenerate, or it's not where it should be, and I want to rebirth it, to have some sort of revolution that's going to make it greater. And so fascism isn't a revolutionary ideology, but for Griffin, first and foremost, it's an idea. It's an ideology. And that was very popular among political scientists, and there was a lot of historians, though, who were quite reticent about using this definition because fascists themselves didn't think about ideas and definitions. Mussolini, he starts fascism in Italy in 1919. He doesn't come up with a definition until 1927.
Yeah.
Hitler starts the National Socialist Workers' Party and doesn't really define his ideas until Mein Kampf in 1925, so 6 years after he's been gone. The Romanian fascists who I study, they really kick off in 1922, but it's 1932 when they first start making serious programmatic ideological statements. So to think about ideas is to put the cart before the horse, or the horse before, yeah.
Maybe a big question, but why do you think that is? Because obviously communists write endlessly. Liberals had whole sort of fields of Enlightenment philosophy really underpinning their ideas. There was a lot of getting everything down on paper very clearly. This is who we are and what we believe. And with fascists, you see, if anything, an aversion to doing that, because it's kind of not the point with them, maybe? What do you think?
Precisely. So they do draw on a really robust ideological system, and most of that ideological system had developed in the 1870s to 1890s. So it's already there for them to pick up and use, and they just mishmash a variety of different things. But I don't think fascism is an ideology in the way that it was, that the communism was or liberalism was, because those are movements that start from ideas and move into practice. Fascism, first and foremost, it's a way of doing politics. It's a practice and a performance, and ideas really come a distant second for most fascists, which is not to say that there aren't important ideas out there, like my nation is great, my nation is really important, we need to do rebirth, Jews are bad, uniforms are good, marching's good. But yeah, those ideas, it's a hodgepodge collection of ideas, not a program or a manifesto that they're building out of.
Right. So there can be a slipperiness that maybe more recently we see fascists utilizing, right? Where there's this, there's a almost a slogan that I think has become really common in recent years, where people will say, if somebody suggests that any of their views or practices are fascist, they will say, well, you call everyone you disagree with a fascist, right? That's something that probably a lot of people have heard levied at them or others. And I feel like behind this rhetorical technique, there's a bit of on some level, I know that because it's maybe a practice first rather than an ideology first sort of political program, there's always a bit of slipperiness. I can always say, I'm just a run-of-the-mill conservative nationalist, or I just have these questions or concerns. They seem actively aware that they have that ambiguity to their own political program.
Yeah. And it's always been that slippery, and it's always been that difficult to define. In this idea of you're a fascist, it really kicks off in the 1960s, particularly in Germany and France with the 1968 rebellions. Mum and dad are fascists, because fascism is about authoritarianism, you imposing your ideas on me. But it becomes really problematic in the 21st century when we start looking at neo-fascists or right-wing populists. For example, in Romania, you've got this right-wing populist movement called AUR, or Alliance for the Unity of Romanians. And they explicitly say, we are like the interwar fascists, we love interwar fascism, we're building on exactly what they believed is what we're promoting. What they're promoting is anti-vaxxer stuff. They're promoting an alliance with Russia. They're promoting anti-homosexual things. All of that, like none of those issues were discussed in the 1930s. Vaccinations wasn't a topic in the 1930s in Romania. And so they actually have very little in common ideologically in terms of their big platforms. Because times have changed. We're in a different world today. Yeah. And so when you start trying to apply something like ask questions, is Donald Trump a fascist? Mm-hmm. It becomes really difficult. Does he like national palingenesis? Is he promoting national rebirth? Well, yeah, his slogans make America great. But at the same time, does he look and behave like fascists in the 1930s? Well, not really. His followers don't wear uniforms.
Right. Yeah.
He's not engaging in street violence in the same way. Mm-hmm. But he does adopt other right-wing stances.
Sure.
So it's just they didn't have Twitter. Hitler couldn't use Instagram.
Thank God Hitler was not tweeting. I mean, in the case of Trump's government, there's certainly not the kind of organized fascist street gangs that we think of with the black shirts, right? But on the other hand, there's a real utilization of sort of state structures like Border Patrol, like ICE specifically. A lot of people have compared them to the Gestapo as this sort of unaccountable kind of, some people are calling it a secret police force. They're actively not identifying themselves. They're wearing masks. I think it's reasonably appropriate. Who are just sort of grabbing people. Some of them are citizens, some aren't. Some are perfectly legally going through the asylum process, and there's no real grounds to detain them. And so a lot of people have looked at that and said this as a practical thing that's happening kind of draws this comparison with historical fascism. What do you make of that comparison?
Yeah, no, it's really useful. And what it's useful for is to say, we've seen stuff like this before, and it was scary, and we don't want to do it again. You don't need a definition for that. Mm-hmm. And I think quibbling over definitions and over words is less useful than saying, hey, we have seen regimes that use secret police before, not just fascist regimes.
Yeah.
Conservative authoritarians did it. The Bolsheviks did it. Mm-hmm. They were doing it under Elizabeth I in Britain.
Yeah.
So this thing that they're doing is bad and we don't like it. Mm-hmm. And you can use historical parallels to say that very clearly. I don't think you need the F word, mm-hmm. the fascism word, unless, not in this case. It doesn't help make your argument.
So I suppose regardless of whether we're using the F word, a lot of people are definitely turning to Italy and Germany in recent years as we've been seeing this kind of surge of right-wing politics, certainly in power especially. I think that there's a lot we can gather about now about the Romanian fascist movements. Would you care to set the scene for us a bit? Like, what was happening in 1920s, 1930s Romania? Where did this come from all of a sudden?
Sure. And that's something that I think we can learn very much about before I get into what happened in Romania, is just the sense of why was fascism successful in Romania? So it was successful because in 1918, Romania, the nation state, expands dramatically. Often, you learn in high school, Hitler won because Germany lost in the war, and the Germans were angry about World War I, and that led to World War II. Romanians were thrilled by World War I, right? Their country expanded dramatically, but they faced a whole heap of problems integrating these new territories into their country, and in particular dealing with minority populations that lived in the newly acquired territories, and they had to make them proper Romanians or, abolish their ethnic identity. But the big thing that happened is universal male suffrage. They said, from now on, all men can vote. Mm-hmm. And they said, we have a democracy now, and your vote counts. And very, very quickly, people saw that my vote doesn't count. We have the same very rich class of oligarchs running the country who have always been running the country. Democracy hasn't actually changed very much. And it's the people who felt like their voice should matter, like the middle classes, the ones, they've got university educations, they have a certain amount of economic prosperity. They expect that their voice should matter in a democracy, and they find that it doesn't. And so they turn to grassroots organising, particularly fascist organising, as a way to have their voice heard. And I think across Europe, we see the more corrupt and the more self-serving institutional government, institutionalised mainstream parties are, the more likely you are to get a radical fascist movement successful and growing up in those countries. And that's something that our political classes today haven't learned. I mean, you see that in them putting forward first Hillary Clinton and then Joe Biden, like these people who clearly are their establishment, right?
Yeah.
And so if you don't like the establishment, your choice is to find someone who's anti-establishment. But what happens in Romania is you've got this expansion of the country. They win they're on the winning side of World War I. And as part of that, they turn the universities into saying, right, ethnic Romanians can go to uni. Because in the past, mostly it was rich people that go to university, and the vast majority of ethnic Romanians in the country are peasants who are very poor, barely finishing 3 or 4 years of primary school, let alone high school and getting onto university.
Yeah.
So the universities are flooded with people who are not really prepared for for university, and they don't have enough books in the library. They don't have enough equipment in the labs. The dorms are over, and canteens are over full, and so students are angry. And their solution is, let's pick on the Jews. If we kick the Jewish students out, then we'd have enough space. And this is an argument that's being made right across East Central Europe during these years. We have to kick the Jews out of universities. And so they start rioting. And on the back of these anti-Semitic riots, you have a handful of established anti-Semitic politicians who have made their political career attacking Jews. They then mobilize the students, take responsibility for them, and form the first sort of right-wing anti-Semitic parties in Romania. As part of their platform is we hate politicians as well as we hate Jews, because the politicians have sold our country out to the Jewish finance, is what they're saying. But in 1925 and 26, you see the leadership of the anti-Semitic political movement. They start behaving like politicians. So they start purging their own parties in order to get ahead themselves. And there's a group of students who were core activists in 1922, and they say, we're not going to stand for this. And so they form their own movement, which they call the Legion of the Archangel Michael. So Romania is an Orthodox country. Orthodox language and iconography is everywhere. And so they draw on that, and they call themselves legionaries. And after about 5 years, they set up a paramilitary unit, because paramilitarism, particularly in Germany, shows that it's successful. And they call their paramilitary unit the Iron Guard.
Yeah.
And that's fairly quickly crushed by the police, but the name sticks. And so historians use the Legion of the Archangel Michael and the Iron Guard interchangeably when talking about this movement. They become increasingly popular and increasingly visible up until 1938. In 1938, the king abolishes democracy and establishes a royal dictatorship. And as part of that royal dictatorship, he abolishes the Legion of the Archangel Michael. And he arrests its leader, Corneliu Zelea Codreanu, puts him in prison, and then that November he's executed. Mm-hmm. The story goes that he was executed while trying to escape. He was garroted.
Right.
How you garrote someone who's running away, I'm not sure. But basically, they took him and about 10 other fascists out into the forest. They shot them repeatedly. The story goes that they buried them in a deep hole and then poured sulfuric acid on the bodies and poured concrete on top of that, because they were afraid that the Codreanu would rise again after 3 days, because of the amount of superstition and the myth that had been built up around this man.
Yeah.
The royal dictatorship collapses in September 1940, and then the Legion, who had been hiding out in Germany at this time because it's a very illegal organization, they come back to the country and they take power. And so the Legion is in power for 4 months, from September 1940 to January 1941, but it's a power sharing arrangement with a general named General Ion Antonescu. And Antonescu then, in January, they can't get on, because the legionaries, they just want to vandalize everything and run amok, and the general liked law and order. So the legionaries rebel against him in January. He crushes them, wipes them out, and then throws Romania into World War II on the side of Hitler, carries out the Holocaust. Romania is the largest state-level perpetrator of the Holocaust after Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
And legionaries sort of survived the war and after the war in communist prisons or else in exile. Yeah.
Is it early on? It sounds like it's really a student movement, and I think that's very interesting, because there's simultaneously in contemporary fascist politics, there's an anti-intellectualism, but kind of combined with a sort of, they're really obsessed with university campuses. It's always about universities. Something's going on. They're all turning everyone into Marxists or whatever. A lot of kind of right-wing influencers have made their careers by going to universities and arguing with 18-year-olds mostly, which gets less impressive the older they get, but it's fine. But what do you make of the student base of the Romanian fascists early on?
Yeah, it's interesting. It looks like a student movement. It's very difficult to know if it was because we don't have good statistics. But students, since there have been universities, there have been student movements, right? And students, they're always highly politicized. In the 19th century, if a peasant, so Romania is like 85% peasants by 1930. It's more than that in the 19th century. And when peasants are revolting, they say, well, students came and told us to revolt. But their word student is just a word for political agitator. Preferably someone that can read and write, but it doesn't mean they were enrolled in a university or something. It's just student was synonymous with a political agitator.
Okay.
In 1922, these are students, and it's about fighting for control of the university, particularly because a lot of these students, they were older than 18. Some of them had fought in World War One. They've got experience as adults, and they want to throw their weight around as adults. They don't like just being told what to do and being treated like children. And so it's not just a struggle over anti-Semitism, it's a struggle over control of the education system. And through the early 1930s, 1920s, sorry, the most visible and vocal aspects of the anti-Semitic movement are students. Mm-hmm. But there's also a massive long-standing movement of anti-Semites that dates back to the 1880s in Romania, of successful middle to upper class people. And students, they're educated and they've got the time to put into activism, but they don't have the money because generally students are broke.
Yeah.
So you need someone to get them out of prison. You need someone to pay their lawyers, to provide meeting houses for them. And there's this whole network of anti-Semites who are rich and successful, standing behind those movements, but we don't often see them very much. Once the Legion kicks off in 27, they start looking for peasants. And so they go into villages and they start recruiting peasants. That first gets successful by about 1931, 32. In 33, they then recruit young intellectuals in Bucharest. And these young intellectuals, they're very smart, but their careers are blocked.
Yeah.
And it's not an anti-intellectualism that's driving the Legion. It's the inability of these young intellectuals to get jobs. And particularly they say, well, because the system's corrupt. You can't become a professor unless you're married to or you're the son of or you're sleeping with one of the professors. Mm-hmm. And then they help your career. And so just because I'm smart is not enough. And so they're fighting for a meritocracy. And then by about 1933, 34, once in the wake of the Great Depression, then they turn to trying to recruit workers as well. So by the mid-1930s, the main support base of the Legion is peasants and workers. Right. It's no longer really students. But in the early 1920s, the students are at the forefront of it all.
That's interesting. Was there an element of these students going into sort of peasant communities and politically agitating? Because there was certainly, in this case, even though fascists often represent this as the case, whether it's true or not, but in this case, it does seem that it was true that there was some pretty significant cultural differences between the people in the countryside and a lot of the people in the cities.
There are massive cultural differences. With the students, though, it's not so big because many of the students come from peasant backgrounds.
Right.
They've left their peasant background. They dress differently. They behave differently when they're in the city, but they still remember what it was like to grow up in a village. It's worth knowing something about the way politics works in interwar Romania, because so if I'm in a village, who do I decide who I vote for? Well, you've got one of the major political parties, and those political parties, they have patronage networks. And so if the mayor of my village is a Liberal, then he will appoint other Liberals to important jobs inside the village.
Right.
So if I want a job or if I need a loan, because often the mayor of the village, he controls the popular bank as well. And so if I need a loan from the bank, it helps for me to be a Liberal voter. And so you choose your party depending on which patronage network you think is going to be most effective and most generous at giving you what you need. And that makes it very difficult for non-mainstream parties to break in. The one group that was able to challenge these established patronage networks were the anti-Semitic parties. But by the late 1920s, there were several counties where they were very successful, and they had sort of blocked off those counties. So the legionaries, when they set their party up, they can't get into the old school, like the mainstream counties, and they can't challenge the anti-Semitic counties, because the anti-Semitic party, the National Christian Defence League, the one they were breaking away from, they already had that vote cornered. And so they have to go, they run challenge by-elections that the mainstream parties didn't think very important, and so couldn't even be bothered sending candidates to.
Right.
And they're the ones where the fascists are successful early on. And whereas when a mainstream politician goes into a village, he rocks up with several cars and a band and a whole heap of alcohol and some food, puts on a big party, gets some loudspeakers, gives away some free wine and makes a speech and then leaves.
Yeah.
The fascists had nowhere near that sort of money. So these students, they would walk miles and miles to get to these villages, sometimes like 20 or 30 miles a day to get to a village. And then they'd turn up with no food, nowhere to stay, and just be like, "Can I sleep at your house tonight?" And then they talk to people while they're sleeping at their houses.
Yeah.
Or they say, "Can we help you bring the harvest in?" And while they're helping you bring the harvest in, they chat to you about politics. And that's a totally different way of doing propaganda to what the mainstream parties were doing. And it's very compelling. The problem that the peasants immediately responded with was, yes, but you can't possibly win, can you? Because you're broke.
Yeah.
And money controls politics in this country. And the students' response was, well, let's try. Vote for me and let's see what we can do.
Yeah.
And the first big national elections that they challenge is 1933. When they try to challenge them, the way elections are organised is the king appoints a political party to organise the elections. And then that political party, say they're the National Peasantist Party, they then appoint police prefects all over the country to supervise the elections. And the police make sure that no one except the National Peasantists are able to carry out political propaganda for those elections.
Right.
So they're very, very rigged. And so when legionaries start trying to challenge the 1933 elections, they're constantly running up against police violence. Several of them die. They're frequently beaten up. And then a week before the elections are about to take place, the government arrests them all to make sure they can't vote in the elections and they can't carry out propaganda in the week before the elections. So they feel like the election, the first one that they challenged and that they put a lot of effort into, was stolen from them. And as soon as they get out of prison, they assassinate the new prime minister, which doesn't go down very well for them. The next time there's national elections in 1937, they've reformed their party, they've changed their tone, they've changed their approach, and they've done political deals with other leading politicians to reduce the amount of political violence that they're facing that allows them to actually run a proper campaign for the first time.
Yeah.
And first and last time.
So we see the state being quite serious about trying to stop these guys and disrupt their political organizing in a way that maybe isn't the case in every country in this period that has fascist movements. They're pretty on top of the Legion.
Yeah, so we find that countries that want to stop fascism can.
Yeah.
For example, in Ireland, the fascist party becomes really popular in the summer of 1934. And what makes them popular is that the government is engaged with a trade war with Britain over beef exports. And so Irish farmers can't sell their cattle, and there's too many cows, and so the government is forcing them to kill their own cows for almost no money. And the farmers are very angry, and that's what pushes fascism forward. But every time the Irish fascists, the blue shirts, try to organise, the government comes in and shuts them down. They put roadblocks around the cities. Anytime they try to put up a stage to set up a rally, the police will demolish it before the rally starts. And so they lose that election because of government interference. In Romania, the government doesn't fight the fascists as heavily as they really should have. In fact, so when you tell the story from the fascist perspective of we were trying to do activism and they stopped us, it sounds like
our humble free speech was infringed upon.
But look at the way they treated communists.
Sure.
Right. Communists, the second that even if you were suspected of being a communist, you were locked up. many died in this period. There was no communist movement in Romania beyond about 10 people who were all in prison because communism was not given a chance. Whereas fascism, in theory, it's forbidden, but in practice, it's encouraged.
Right.
Like they give them space and they give them political, they give them newspaper time in ways that if they had really wanted to shut them down, they wouldn't have done.
Sounds familiar.
It sounds a lot like imagine the BBC if they only reported on some fringe populist party which had like 3 people in parliament instead of what the mainstream political party is doing in government.
Yeah.
And they
Can you imagine?
Yeah, it's insane, isn't it? And so in 1923, there's a group of student activists led by Corneliu Zelea Codreanu, and they go on a murder spree. And so they all travel to Bucharest and they say, we're going to assassinate leading Jewish figures in the city.
Right.
But they're betrayed at the last minute. They admit everything. They go to trial and the jury acquits them and says it's actually fine because they're good boys with good motives.
Good motives.
And then, because they're doing it for their country, right?
Yeah, sure.
And then afterwards, Codreanu, he goes home to his city of Iași, and he organizes a group of high school boys, and they're planning to attack the police prefect. And they've got a map of his house there. They're going to break into his house at nighttime and do horrible things. And so he arrests them all and then releases them the next day. But Codreanu and his friends say, we got molested by the police in custody. And so he mobilizes the parents and they put the police prefect on trial for child abuse, basically. After the first day of the trial, Codreanu then shoots the police prefect on the steps of the courthouse. And so he goes to trial for murder.
So I'm guessing the first trial wasn't going his way.
Yeah, basically. He realized he wasn't going to get justice from that trial. And so he goes on trial for murder, and again, the jury lets him off. They acquit him because they say, well, his motives were valid because they were nationalist. And I never understood this. I thought this is bizarre.
Yeah.
Until at the time I was really writing this up for the first time, I was living in America, and George Zimmerman murdered Trayvon Martin. This white man shoots a black child for wearing a hoodie, and he says, I felt threatened because this kid wore a hoodie near me. And the jury said, yeah, that's fair. I believe that you were scared.
Right.
And that's a legitimate fear. And that's exactly the same thing that's happening in interwar Romania, is the government and the society and the legal system is biased in favor of the fascists. And so they can get away with a ridiculous amount of things that normally they would not, like any normal person would not be able to get away with. And as soon as you allow fascists to flaunt the legal system, to organize insurrections and not face judgment for that, or get away with stealing government documents and keeping them in your mansion in Florida, they will thrive.
So would it be fair to say that in these early days in Romania that the state was willing to oppose them insofar as they kind of challenged established political power, but when they were trying to do pogroms and things like that, that there was a strong sense of not being that concerned about what they were up to?
Very much. A better example is, in November of 2024, Romania had national elections, national presidential elections. And the way presidential elections work in Romania is it's like the French system, where everyone votes for maybe 6 or 10 candidates, and then the top 2, unless someone gets more than 50% of the vote, the top 2 go forward to a final second round runoff.
Yeah.
And so in November 2024, an unknown candidate, Călin Georgescu, appeared out of nowhere and got the highest popular vote in the first round, gets through to the second round, but no one had ever heard of him before. He wasn't one of the major political figures. His campaign was run entirely on TikTok, and he looked and sounded a lot like Putin. So you get these photos of him circulating, riding bareback on a horse. You know, the famous picture of Putin doing that, or of swimming. And his rhetoric is very much is nationalist rhetoric. He says things like, I love the Holocaust was great. And he's very pro-Putin. And so everyone just assumed that he was or the political elites and commentators, they all just assumed he was a Russian clone and that the election had been rigged by the Russians. The Constitutional Court, which is appointed by the sitting government, looked into it and found evidence, which they then published, that he had been supported by the Russians, that there was a Russian electoral interference in the 2024 presidential elections. So they banned him from running again. They reset the elections and held a new set of elections the following year. But they also looked into the money trail because he declared that he spent zero money on his political campaign.
Okay.
And they're like, this is weird. But the surprising thing was that the money for his campaign had come from the National Liberal Party, because the National Liberals, they always get into the second round, but they needed a candidate that they could easily defeat in the second round. And so they put him up as a straw man candidate, hoping that they could then defeat him in the second round. They didn't make it to the second round. And this was, one, it's embarrassing for them, but two, it shows the way that political parties will use extremist groups, and they sort of encourage them, provided that to make themselves look like a more rational alternative. Yeah. Or, to give them a better chance in the chess game that is politics. And this is the sort of thing that's happening around 32, 33 in Romania, is you get things like the National Peasantists and the National Liberals using the fascists as pawns, basically, to get themselves more votes.
Yeah, I mean, we see that. I think that's quite a common political strategy. I think a lot of people have sort of suggested in their analysis that Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016, maybe not going so far as to fund them, but certainly her preferred outcome was to run against Donald Trump, because the idea was, this is a ridiculous person and it's going to be a layup.
Precisely, and if you have an alternative candidate, they can often split the opposition vote. Yeah, which gives more votes than it strengthens the majority mainstream candidate.
And it never goes wrong. That's the thing about it.
No.
All right. I want to talk a bit about, I think, the thing that really makes this fascist movement so unique and interesting, which is the incredibly religious nature of it. You see it in bits in other fascist movements. Obviously there's some Catholicism present in Mussolini's fascism. I would say that the Nazis were they sought to control the church, certainly, but I don't think that they used religion nearly as much in a lot of their rhetoric and imagery. And I can't help but notice that the more troubling aspects of the far right, especially in America, is very, very strongly Christian. There's this, for as long as I've been alive, people have been talking about this simmering kind of extreme evangelical faction who at varying periods seem to, have more and more power. What makes this, I'm trying to think of how to put this. Obviously, the anti-Semitism feeds easily into this religious view, but what really makes this fascist movement different, if anything, because of its strong kind of Christian core?
Yeah, I'm not sure it was that different. Okay. So, for example, in Belgium, the Rexist movement, which is the big fascist movement there, is led by a young Catholic priest. Yeah. And he says this is the Catholic movement. It's about Catholic youth. Yeah. In Czechoslovakia, the Slovak People's Party is run by a Catholic priest. And he says if you're Slovak, you must be Catholic. If you're Catholic, you must vote for us. The same in... Sweden and Norway, they're pushing Lutheranism very, very strongly. One of the big problems that the Nazis had in Germany is that the country split between Protestants and Catholics. Yeah. And so it's really hard to get a strong Catholic or Protestant mobilization around one political fascist party. And in Germany, the Catholics had their own political party, which was unchallengeable. It was the one bloc that was stopping Hitler until they disbanded it. But in Romania, you have an Orthodox church. It's a majority Orthodox population, and the Romanian Orthodox Church was deeply intertwined with Romanian identity and the Romanian national movement for decades prior to independence. And so the Orthodox Church sees itself as part of the nation state and the nation state as an expression of itself. Large numbers of priests get involved in the movement, in the Legion of the Archangel Michael, which again is a religious name. You also get theologians and bishops throwing their weight behind it. Officially, the church says, we don't agree with this, and that's because the patriarch was a liberal.
Right.
His patronage networks that had made him patriarch were tied to the National Liberal Party.
Okay.
And so he wasn't willing to support the fascists. But many of his bishops who were angry at he got to be patriarch and not me, they saw fascism as a way to do it. One of the key reasons why this works is Codreanu's right-hand man was a guy named Jon Motza. And Jon Motza's father was a priest. He grew up thinking, and he was amazingly good at writing and reading theology. And so in 1927, when they launched their first manifesto, they say the old political party, Lang, the old anti-Semitic party, they were doing politics. We've never done politics for a day in our lives. We have a religion. We're slaves to a faith. And he says we're seeking the light of Jesus Christ, and we're fighting the holy battle against the Jewish enemy who is Satan. And so they split the world into good and evil, into Christians versus Jews, into Christians versus communists. Jews and communists, they're the same, and they're all part of Satan. And so that religious elision is really effective because it allows them to write off their enemies in very useful rhetorical ways. Right. The best example I've seen as to how this sort of language works and why it works so successfully comes from a rhetorician, a language scholar from the University of Sheffield named Valerie Hobbs. And she said, if you look at when Brexit was happening the Brexit campaign was happening in Britain, and Theresa May was trying to negotiate the terms of Brexit in Brussels, Boris Johnson was attacking Theresa May because he was trying to threaten to challenge her power base so that he could become Prime Minister. And he gets a front page spread where he says, Theresa May should tell the Pharaoh in Brussels, let my people go. Okay. Right? So what's Boris Johnson trying to do there? No one would suggest that Boris Johnson is trying to promote himself as a Christian. Yeah. I don't think that wasn't part of his public image. But he's drawing on a story that every British person knows, the story of the people of Israel coming out of Egypt and Moses versus the Pharaoh. Say he'd drawn on Shakespeare, then he'd come off as a bit of a toff, as a bit of, too posh and above us. But a Christian children's story, a Sunday school story is one that's safe. But more than that, if you challenge him on it and you say, do you really think that the people in Brussels are promoting slavery the way that the Egyptians were making the Jews slaves? He said, no, it was just a joke. Right. And so you can wipe it off. But actually, it's not really a joke, is it? Yeah, no, of course not. It's a way of painting your enemy in very negative terms, all the while being able to say, well, the metaphor doesn't go all the way, does it? Yeah. And religion's very, very powerful for that. Right. And right-wing populists use it in that way. You see Trump using it like that constantly. He doesn't buy the whole thing, and he doesn't follow his ideas through to the end. Yeah. For example, I did a bit of research trying to work out, did legionaries in the 1930s Romania believe in angels? Okay. So when they say we follow the angel, Archangel Michael, he is our patron, did they really think they were following a supernatural being? Or was it just a useful metaphor for them? Yeah. Was it, a coat of arms, a mascot, or did they really believe it? And a lot of the scholars that pushed the Romanian fascism was a religious cult movement, they would say, yes, they really believe it. But if you look closely at legionary writings, you find them using the language of the archangel in very poetic ways and in ways that suggest that it was just a metaphor for them. It wasn't real. And the people least likely to believe in angels, so there's widespread belief in angels in interwar Romania. The least likely group was young university-educated men who were the largest cohort of early legionary activists. So the guys that made it all up and were pushing the head activists, they themselves were not likely actually to have believed in supernatural beings called angels.
Right.
And so I think you've got to be really careful when you're talking about religion as to what sort of religion do you think they had and what were they doing with it. And that's an ongoing debate with inside study of Romanian fascism is were they really religious or not? And historians are really divided on this question.
That's interesting because obviously we always have to be cautious how liberal we are in drawing these sorts of parallels because this was a century ago. But yeah, like you said when you brought up Trump, it's like I don't think anyone would accuse him of being the most devout Christian man in the universe, but he's certainly very happy to use these things when they're politically advantageous. Is it fair to say that there must have been at least some of that happening in Romania? This is a very religious place. It seems very clear that the religious framing of their movement was effective, right? At a point, I guess it didn't really matter if a lot of the leadership were really sincerely holding these beliefs or not.
And that's true. And the thing to remember about a movement is it's multifaceted. So the most useful metaphor I've ever seen for this comes from a book called Anti-Oedipus.
That's a great book.
By Deleuze and Guattari. And they say we're not interested in analysing a neurotic lying on a couch. Because most historians, when they come against someone like Hitler, they say, what's he obsessed with? What's his one single obsession? And let's unpack that. And he'll tell us all about it in Mein Kampf, and then we'll understand Hitler.
Yeah.
These guys say, I want to study a schizophrenic out for a walk. I want to study a movement with multiple voices and multiple people vying for power and multiple positions vying for power inside the movement. And then as it moves through space and time and it encounters other people and other obstacles, some voices come to the fore and some sit back. And so I don't think you can generalize about an entire movement. 100%. There were some people in the Legion who saw it as a religious crusade.
Yeah.
And they were believers, priests often, who had dedicated their lives to serving the church, to seeking God. And then there were others for whom this was a very useful movement that allowed them to kill Jews.
Right.
And sometimes those two positions, they're united in a single individual. But often they're not.
Something I really noticed, full disclosure, I took Roland's fascism module here 3 years ago, so however many years ago now. And you had us reading a lot of, I believe some were diaries, but I think a lot were accounts much later in life from people who were involved in this movement when they were younger, living in these nests, right? These kind of collective living situations that a lot of them had. And something that always really struck me is that a lot of what they would talk about was really very mundane. A lot of people just kind of seemed to be there on almost a social level. And when they would talk about it, the more ideological aspects, I'm sure they were anti-Semitic, but they weren't really, that wasn't something that every day they were like, today we're going to get them. It was just like, I'm here with my buds and we're kind of doing these sort of productive things together. It was very banal, really.
And most social movement activism is. You've got to fit in the scene.
Yeah.
Think about, do most people become Nazi activists because they read Mein Kampf and suddenly they were persuaded by the power of the words?
Yeah, these guys can't read.
Or was there a cute girl at a rally? Or your brother got murdered by police? Or there's often some triggering incident that forces you to go from being an interested outsider or a sympathizer into becoming an activist. And it's a big step for people to become an activist.
Yeah.
And it very rarely is just to do with ideas.
Yeah.
It's normally to do with some sort of life experience. So, but at the same time, the legionaries, they frequently talked about this as a religion, right? And so I said, well, if it's a religion, they must have had conversion experiences. Let's go through all of these accounts of people who, because we have many, many accounts of why they become legionaries, and they're not describing conversion experiences.
Okay.
And so, yeah, it was a decision, and often it was a decision based on family members, or because they became really good friends with someone. And certain charismatic individuals were able to draw other people in. And a lot of it really depended on how effective the leader of your small group was.
Yeah.
If they were an effective leader, they could draw multiple people in and make it a functioning group. If they weren't very good, the group would splinter and collapse. And that works for religious movements. It works for political movements. It works for most social movements. And you've got to fit so legionary women, they refused to wear makeup and they wouldn't go out on dates with boys.
Yeah.
If you're a girl that likes makeup and pretty dresses, you're not going to fit in.
Right.
Say I want to be an anarchist, and I rock up to an anarchist commune where everyone's in a nice collared shirt and talking like a university professor.
Right.
Most of the homeless people in that anarchist commune are not going to take me as their friend,
Sure,
and I'm not going to fit in. And so you need it to be a welcoming community of like-minded, but also socially homogenous people. And you find when you look at the records, fascists frequently come from the same extended family or worked in the same workplaces or lived on the same streets.
Yeah. That makes me interested in the transition, I guess, from because correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of these early collective living situations in the cities, this is more the students, and then we start getting these peasants and workers. Would these people have would it have been functional for them to cohabitate? It doesn't seem like
it wasn't, and they didn't.
Yeah.
These were student dorms, or a couple of times when students couldn't get into dorms, the fascists would set up like their own dormitories.
Yeah. Sounds like some of them were in kind of poor states as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But normally in the majority of cases, it was just people that lived close to each other.
Okay. That makes sense. Well, just thinking about time, I want to get to something that I've really been thinking about based on seeing how right-wing rhetoric kind of exists now. I want to just sort of pull something directly from your book, Holy Legionary Youth. Buy it now. So scholars of fascism have always kind of observed that there's an importance on a mythic past, right? Constructing some great place that we were at before that usually, X and Y group have pulled us away from and corrupted, and we have to get rid of them to go back and be great again. Obvious parallels in a lot of current right-wing movements, right? Make America Great Again is that's explicitly just saying exactly that, what many 20th century fascists say in far more words, right? Something I've noticed in a lot of the Legion rhetoric, and you mentioned this in your book, is the need to create a new man, which is actually something that we hear a lot from socialists of the period, right? The new Soviet man is kind of an idea of a better person with better values who can actually live in a better society, right? Do you think that fascism now has become more backward looking? I don't think there's any talk now about creating a new sort of person.
Yeah, so fascists in the 20s and 30s, they were backward looking as well.
Yeah.
So you've got like Mussolini, he wants to recreate ancient Rome.
Definitely.
And you see that in the way he's building stuff and his use of words like fascism itself is an ancient Roman word. The ancient Roman salute.
Yeah.
And then you've also, in Britain, their golden age that they wanted to go back to was the Elizabethan age.
Yeah.
With Shakespeare and Marvel and Sir Francis Drake and these guys. So fascists, they're often going back to a mythical golden age.
Absolutely.
And they're complaining about modernity. They're saying this modern society is no good, but it's what a scholar by the name of Jeffrey Hirsch has called reactionary modernism.
Okay.
So they're saying some parts of modernity are no good, but at the same time, we really like machines.
Right.
Like the Romanian fascists loved motorbikes. They were really into motorbikes. The British fascists, they were fascinated by aeroplanes.
Right.
And the Italian fascists, you have this whole artistic movement called futurism, which is about technology and speed. And so they're trying to push themselves into the future, but grounding that future into a mythical agrarian past, and saying what's most true about us are our connections with the soil, our kinship connections, our ethnic groups, and our family connections. And we want to, instead of being grounded in this baseless liberalism, which they saw humanitarianism was a dirty word, liberalism was a dirty word, democracy was a dirty word, because all of these, they're pushing away at the firm grounds of being that we have. They're getting rid of religion. They're getting rid of certainty. By doing this sort of Kantian critique of knowledge, they eventually you're left with nothing, right? What are you standing on? And so the fascists are saying we have to get rid of that and have a modernity grounded in national being and in the national family. And if we have that, then we can build a new future. And so they're very future focused, but it's a future focused with its feet in the past.
Yeah.
These days, fascists, and also in the 1930s, they're not very explicit about what the future will look like.
Yeah.
The future is very, very vague.
Yeah.
But their discussions of the past are often much more grounded.
Definitely. I think we've all seen AI-generated pictures of like suburban American families with white picket fences being posted by people with pretty extreme right-wing politics, and you're just meant to intuit that somehow we go back to that, and somehow that was very good also. Right?
And somehow that actually existed.
Yeah.
Which it never did, realistically. Historically, there was no historical period when this right-wing fantasy that they promote of white people and proper gender roles and everything, it never happened. But they're trying to recreate that mythical time and space.
Yeah.
But at the same time, these right-wing populists are using technology in amazing ways.
Yeah.
Like, who is funding Trump most? It's the tech giants.
Yeah.
Putin is really technologically savvy. They are using social media and they're using technology in really cutting-edge ways to create a new world, not a past world, a new world in the future.
Yeah.
But the myth is of the past, and that's the sustaining myth that it allows them to mobilize people around.
Yeah. So thinking about, I guess, how tied up these movements come to also national narratives, right? Even if they're totally fictionalized, like the endless fields of perfect white American suburbs, of certainly a lot about the Roman Empire in the Italian case. Because you went and lived in Romania for a few years, right? While you were working on a lot of this, was there ever a tension there? Was there? Did you ever run into people maybe not being thrilled about you looking into this? I'm curious about what your experience was, kind of on the ground researching. I'm going to another country and I'm looking at this kind of ugly chapter of your history, how that ties into the story that maybe your country tells about itself.
Yeah. So Romanian history is horrific. But I can stomach it because I'm not Romanian.
Yeah.
I can't write Australian history. Australian history is too horrific. The crimes that Australians did to the Aboriginal people and to each other, it hits me too hard.
Yeah.
And whereas I can deal with talking about Romanian history. When you write about it, the immediate assumption is that as a foreigner, he doesn't really know.
Okay.
And most Romanian reviews of my book, the biggest, most common comment was, "Wow, he actually knows."
That's quite a compliment.
The reviewers were really shocked that a foreigner could have a deep understanding of Romanian culture. Before I started, so I tried learning languages at university, and classroom language study is not for me.
Sure.
So I lived there for 18 months to learn the language before I even started the study. And that's because the sort of cultural history that I write, you need to know the culture inside out.
Right.
You need to get the jokes, the internal jokes.
Yeah.
Because if you don't get those, you're not really understanding what's going on. And so a shallow understanding of the language and culture wouldn't work to write the sorts of cultural history that I'm writing. But at the same time, once you get into archives, being a foreigner can be very useful.
Right.
So I was a young foreign guy with broken Romanian when I first started out, and the archives, the reading rooms are run by these middle-aged women who are like, oh, look at the cute little foreigner. And so they're really generous with me and really helpful to me in ways that they wouldn't have been to an ethnic Romanian, particularly to women. I know that female Romanian students who have gone in and researchers, when they go to the same archive asking for the same thing as me, they don't get it. And they don't get the same help that me as a cute foreign male gets. And the same goes for, while I was researching, I started to get to know the neo-fascist groups because I wanted their connections and for them to be able to share materials with me, which they really did. Like, they were really generous and excited that this foreign guy wants to learn about our history and culture. Here, have this book. This is a really rare one. Here, I'll introduce you to this old man that was there at the time.
Wow.
And they were really generous and helpful, which they wouldn't have been if I was a native. Because if I'm a local, you read the subtle cues and you think about what separates me and you. But when a foreigner comes in,
They couldn't place you.
They couldn't place me.
Yeah.
And that actually makes them much more generous and helpful than if I was a local trying to navigate the same things.
Interesting. I mean, I would imagine that being white helped in that situation. Do they have any kind of preconceptions about Australians or?
No, Australia is literally the other side of the world.
Yeah, so they're just like, you might as well be from the moon.
Dig a hole in Romania, you end up in Australia.
Yeah. That's how you get there, actually.
Yeah. People of African descent or Asian descent struggle in Romania, especially people of black skin color.
Yeah.
It's quite a racist society. And so whiteness helps, Australianness. Everyone loves Australia around the world except for people in the Pacific. In the Pacific, they see us at the end of our guns. They see us as a local policeman and a bully. But Europeans in general, Australians never tried invading Europe. Well, we did once in 1916, but it didn't go so well.
No. Better luck next time.
Yeah. Generally, Australians have a great reputation internationally, and that really helps a lot when you're trying to get to know people. Yeah. And so say I'm a foreigner coming to Britain and my English is not perfect, people will judge you on that.
Right.
If you're a foreigner going to Romania and your Romanian is even understandable, people will love you for that because you've made an effort.
I find that in non-English speaking countries a lot of the time is they'll be a lot more forgiving, with the exception of maybe some like France who get mad at you no matter what, but that's fine. Yeah, I can see how that would help. I can see how that would help a lot.
Yeah. No, it's not a bad thing being a foreigner when you're studying something. In my undergrad, I did a joint honours in history and religious studies. In religious studies, they always told us, whatever you do, don't study your own tradition.
Okay.
Study any religious tradition, but not your own, because you won't have the same critical distance, and you won't. What drives me, what the central question that I ask, my research question, whatever my project is, what the hell, right? I see something that's strange and unusual, and I want to understand it.
Yeah.
But in my own culture, you don't see the strangeness of it.
Yeah.
And therefore it's harder to really want to research in the same way and to ask the right questions.
That makes a lot of sense. And like you said before, there's an emotional distance as well that you can have that's really useful with a lot of these difficult histories.
When it's so dark and it's so horrific, yes.
Yeah. I think coming from Canada, it's hard to have as much distance here because there's so much crossover. Especially looking at 18th and 19th century, it's the same ecosystem of kind of colonialism, I suppose.
But once you get to the 18th century, it's a different world again.
Yeah. That's true.
There's a beautiful essay, which I'm sure you've read, called The Great Cat Massacre.
Yes.
Where the historian says, look, at this one time in the 1780s, all these workers in a printing factory, they got together and they murdered 50 cats in the neighborhood and strung them all up across the printing yard and thought that was hilarious.
Right.
And he says, once I understand why that was funny, then I can understand the 18th century.
Yeah.
Because to me, that's not funny. Right? And once you've got to you've got to come in see it as strange, and then you can unpack it.
Yeah. And then you can bring it back almost. And I think that once you're able to approach it that way, it becomes almost more familiar again. You start to see, once you've I guess, accepted and embraced what is so alien, you then start to see things that are sometimes very disturbingly kind of similar and will remind you of current things. Certainly looking at historical fascism does that, but even going back much further, you can see the ingredients, maybe.
And having lived through it makes you ask different questions too. So, for example, I teach a master's seminar on the 1919 influenza pandemic.
Okay.
And I started doing that after COVID. Because having lived through COVID, you know what questions to ask about a society that's also going through a pandemic 100 years earlier. And the questions that we're asking now about fascist movements in the 1920s and 30s are different to the questions we were asking 15 years ago because we're living through worrying populism. It's more urgent, and also we're seeing things that we want to know, we want to understand. And so we're asking different questions about the past. Based on what we really want to know about the present.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this.
Thanks for having me. It's been a really fascinating discussion.
Well, that was some fine podcasting right there. If you want to see more like that, why don't you go on down to the Patreon, patreon.com/KMcGregor, and subscribe to the $5 a month or more, if you like, tier. And you will get a bonus episode for every episode except for this one. This was kind of a pilot, right? Kind of a proof of concept. But you can help me pay for things like a third camera, which you might notice I do not have, which a lot of well-produced video podcasts absolutely do have. More microphones, being able to use my microphones instead of relying on kind of what other people have sitting around, things like that, which led to the audio in this episode being, it was all right, but it wasn't quite up to my standard. Just generally increasing the production quality of the whole thing. Go on down to the Patreon, $5 tier or higher, and you'll get bonus episodes every month, except for this one. And you'll help me make this whole operation a little better. If you get in now, you could be on the ground floor of this whole thing. So get in there. And thank you for watching, honestly. I'm really excited for what I got coming up for you guys. Take care.